Hi friends, and welcome. On today's adventure, Tina and I are headed out west. We're going out to see our good friends Pete and Judy, Paul, Susan, Colby, everybody out at Shelton Ranch Outfitters. We're going out to the Rocky Mountains for some early archery elk hunting. Now this is something we try to do every chance we get. I absolutely love going out to the mountains and finding the first taste of fall every year, and this year is no exception. We're going to go out there. Pete told me on the phone before we left it's been really dry, but despite that, we are seeing some elk, and I gotta admit I was pretty anxious to get my stick pusher and head to the top of a mountain and try to bugle up a bull. Even if the conditions are tough, I'm still gonna go. Hey, I'm your host, Kyle Randall. This is my Wilderness Journal, and we're headed out west right now. What mountain? I didn't see any mountain. If you've never been there, the drive through the canyons west of Denver is worth the trip all by itself. And believe me, rolling up and seeing Shelton Ranch again, getting to talk to Judy and Pete, stowing our stuff, it really is like coming home to us. It was great to be back in the mountains, back at the Sheltons, visiting with our old friends. And I have to tell you, I was looking forward to getting up on the mountain. We hunt the very first week of the archery season out there, and it is, by all accounts, the toughest week to hunt. Still, we've had some pretty good successes here. We've taken a lot of friends out there, and if you're not a frequent flyer, let me show you, we've had our share of close encounters. It was good to be back in Colorado, back on Pete's Mountain, and on opening day of archery season, it was really good to be back in the elk. From my vantage point, I could see a herd of at least 75 elk working their way up to bed. Another 15 or so were on the side of a hill in a hayfield being pushed around by a bull. Every year when I come here, I expect to see elk, but you never really know. Until you get out there bow in hand and you actually see them, there's always going to be that little bit of doubt. That's the way it is if you're a traveling archery hunter. It's all about getting there and then getting up close and doing the dance. That's why I hunt this way. And I have to tell you, coming back to Pete's Mountain, to the Shelton's Ranch, for me, it feels a little like going home. There were some real nice satellite bulls surrounding this group, but it was obvious who the lord and master of this harem was. This, friends, is what a giant elk looks like. This is a mega bull. And when he started walking more or less straight at me, I have to admit my hopes started going up, even if just a little bit. You don't often get a chance to see, let alone get a shot at a bull like this. He'd worked to within about 120 yards, a mere chip shot for Whisper, but unfortunately well out of my bow range. All I could do was sit there and hope he would chase one of those cows a little closer. And I should tell you about now that I'm firmly convinced mental telepathy doesn't work on elk. Because in my head I was screaming, "Come here, come here," and it just seemed like, he couldn't hear me. Well, now it's true that in that first week the elk are usually still in one big bunch and they don't often come to calls, but the good news is sometimes they do. They're still bugling.
Yep.
Let's just sit here for a few minutes and call a little bit more. What do you say?
I think that.
Just as I finished a bull squeal, I looked up and there were cows coming over the hill, walking right straight down at us. We were sitting right out in the open. We were just tucked into some sagebrush, and those cows came right down on top of us. I'm talking 3, 4, 5 feet off of Tom's nose was a cow. There was another one to my side, and then A bull, a dandy bull, was coming down the hill after those cows. We were sitting right in front of a wallow, and if he came down and got in that wallow, he'd be like 25, 30 yards max in front of Tom, and he was going to get his shot. Last morning, last chance, and here it came. That bull walked right straight down into the wallow. After bugling in Tom's face, I whispered for Tom to get up. Then I whispered again, and I whispered again. I could hear the bull coming up out of the wallow. I whispered again, this time so loud the bull could hear me. He trotted up the hill. Finally, Tom stood, and he was too late. The bull was well out of range. Oh, man.
You're not supposed to put the cows right in my lap.
What?
Supposed to put the bull.
What? You said you wanted elk. I put one 3 feet in front of you. That ain't close enough?
I could see and smell her breath.
Look, you put your 2-foot pin just a little bit high and you shoot them.
Yeah. That was up close and personal, like they say.
That's the way we like it.
Yeah, perfect.
Last morning here at Shelton Ranch, get a big old 6x6 bull right in there and still can't shoot him. Yeah. Well, I guess fear of being trampled is a good enough reason for not getting off a shot and therefore not getting an elk. But we've had other experiences that were, well, let's just say a little harder to explain. He's coming to the water. Brandon had come 2,000 miles and waited an entire lifetime for this moment. And now it was finally here. A gorgeous bull, no more than 30 yards out. Brandon waited until he figured he'd drunk his fill and then drew his bow, anticipating the turn. But the bull just stood there. Brandon finally had to let his bow down, and of course, as soon as he did, he drew again. The bull was walking right out in front of him. It couldn't get any better than this. And then he turned again. Brandon waited, and then he turned back. Get another arrow. Get an arrow. Brandon had missed, but the bull was still standing there. There was still a chance. Get it up. Hurry up. And then, hurry up.
He's already too far.
And then there was none. The bull just walked away. Now rest assured, we don't always have a train wreck when we come out here. Sometimes things do work out. I don't know where that front one went, but them other two bucks are kind of going the wrong way. I have no idea. Most of them, they got behind that hill and I can't see them. But they kind of act like they... There's one at the water. Right there, right there. Talk about intense. Nice job, Miss T. That is hunting right there. We watched those bucks for an hour and 20 minutes. We never spooked them. And I'm pretty sure we smoked that deer. That is intense. He's absolutely done. We got him, girl. Yeah, here. Let me, here, you can just set it there or hang on. You want to hold it?
I'll hold it.
All right, take a look. Let me get out here. Look at that beast. That thing.
He's beautiful.
Look at that. Be it elk or mule deer or even antelope, we have had some tremendous adventures out there, and I was looking forward to the opener in the morning. I did take my bow out for a few practice shots. It was really windy and I wanted to make sure everything was working right because in the morning, well, let's just say I had high hopes of seeing something. I'm gonna try a couple of shots in this wind just to see how bad it's gonna be to deal with. But I think it's gonna make it tough. Whenever I get to a place where I've been on the road, I always take a couple of test shots. I shoot my bow, my gun, my muzzleloader, whatever it is. It's smart to make sure everything made the trip in as good a shape as possible. And no sooner had I taken my first practice shot in all that wind and then started to go and retrieve my arrow, I looked back and I saw something. Look at that. Look right there. That's smoke. Look at that. There was definitely smoke coming from the other side of the ranch. Tina and I jumped in the truck and raced Pete across the ranch and out to the county road, and there was definitely a fire on the ranch just across the road from Pete and Judy's, and it was blowing right at us. I sent Tina back to the ranch house to call it in, and I opened the gate and ran in there just to see was there anything I could do. This fire was racing across that mountain. I ran up far enough so I could see into the draw, and in every direction, fire had already topped over and was racing down the sides. We needed to do something, anything, and we needed to do it pretty quick. The fire had just topped the mountain and started racing down the face in front of me when Pete got there. We moved a couple of pieces of equipment out of its path and then started looking around for something, anything we could use to help. And then fortunately, we found some. We stood there looking around and then Pete noticed something. Get that dozer and go do it. We're gonna try something. There was a bulldozer sitting up on an adjacent ridge. We ran up there, fortunately found the keys in it, and Pete started driving it right down across in front of the fire. We were gonna try to make a fire break. It was so smoky, I went out in front of him. You couldn't see to drive 10, 15 feet. We started cutting across there, and every time I looked over my shoulder, that fire was getting closer and closer. And then finally, the BLM and the Forest Service showed up, and they'd brought some help with them too.
Air support.
With reinforcements in place, Pete and I finally got the back out of there. In fact, Paul, Pete's son, jumped in the same dozer we'd commandeered and went to cutting more fire breaks. He worked through the whole night helping those guys and kept that fire from roaring all the way across both ranches. We did see a lot of animals moving out in front of that fire, but fortunately, Nobody lost any possessions, nobody's house burnt down, and as we like to say here at the Journal when we claim a moral victory, hey, nobody died. With Paul Shelton, Pete's son, now on that dozer cutting fire breaks, and the BLM and the Forest Service, the air tankers, all the local guys there, we finally got back away from that fire and got a chance to settle down, go in, cough up some soot, get cleaned up. They were getting it handled. It was obvious they were going to be able to contain it, but I'd be lying if I told you I slept very good that night. And in the cool light of the next morning, we looked around and saw that fortunately, Pete and Judy's place hadn't burned, the fire hadn't jumped the road. And while we were certainly thankful for that, this time the ranch was spared, we did want to get in the buggy and go over and have a look at Wynn's place and see just how bad it got hurt.
It's gonna be bad for a little while.
Yeah, it's a mess.
That wind comes up.
Tina was right, it could still whip up again, but fortunately, most of the mop-up was done, the crews were pulling out. I stood there looking around, thinking about this ground I'd hunted for so long. It certainly hurt a little to see it like this, but I knew that it would be back, and I also knew that but for the hard work of a lot of good people, it could have been a whole lot worse. Well, the BLM and the state and local crews, with Paul Shelton's considerable help on that dozer, I might add, had it licked, they had it under control, and with a couple of guys left behind, just in case things flared up, it was finally time for us to get back to looking for elk. We spent the rest of that day and the morning of the next just trying to get a handle on what the critters were doing, trying to see where the elk might have been pushed to by the fire. There were deer starting to come back on the ranch, including some nice deer. Unfortunately, this year I didn't have a deer tag. I was just elk hunting, so we just kept looking. We got deer here. The deer were definitely starting to come back to the ranch. Things were starting to settle down, and the very next morning I realized they weren't the only ones coming back home. Just after sunrise the next morning, a sizable band of antelope was working its way in across the big field, and when I say in, I mean they were wrapping around a small hill and coming more or less into me. There were at least a dozen does in this group and one really nice buck. And if he kept pushing them the same way, they were going to wind up right down in my lap, right out in front of me. I stood there and watched as he brought all those girls roaring over the hill and down into the new seating that Pete had put in right in front of me. He even bedded down right there at less than 70 yards. There was only one problem with this whole deal. The antelope tag that I did have was for Wyoming. Yeah, that was next week. We hunted really hard for the last couple of days, and each day we saw more and more critters coming back, acting more naturally. What we weren't seeing, at least not yet, was any more elk, so we just kept moving and looking higher and higher up. I don't need more lightning. It's real unfortunate for Wynn to have that burn, but it's, just a gift from God that it blew the direction it blew, because if it had gone any other way, it had taken out this whole corner, this whole ranch, everything. You can still smell the smoke. Got the critters all stirred up, but at least nobody's house burnt down. A long time since I went running into a forest fire. Fella should make a habit of that. Not if he wants to get old. Although Pete run right in there and jumped in that dozer. It's not something I suggest highly.
Well, it didn't do my heart any good. Watching you both do that.
Yeah, you'd want your neighbors to help you, you know. That's
I know, it's still scary.
As they used to say, the code of the West. Well, there was a day that meant something, and to me, and I guess to Pete, it still does.
Still scary.
Oh yeah, nothing about wildfire that isn't, especially not when you're out in front of it. Some deer down there. Don't see nothing. Just gonna have to just keep going up. And for the next day and a half, that's exactly what I did. I climbed higher and higher, glassed and called, looked in every direction. There were deer and antelope. I even saw another hunter up on the high ground, but unfortunately, I finished my hunt without seeing another elk the rest of the week. Still, I couldn't say that it hadn't been exciting, and you can bet come next year, I'll be back. My friends, I oftentimes say life, that's what's happening while you're making other plans. Yeah, we didn't get an elk on this trip, but I will tell you, I'm looking forward to getting back there next year to a hunt with it's a little less hectic, a little more predictable. And I should also tell you that by the time we got up to Wyoming the next day, I'd talked to Judy on the phone, and the hunters that followed us into camp were already seeing elk at their stands. So things were coming back. They were getting more normal. And speaking of normal, running into a fire might not be a great idea, but in my world at least, doing anything and everything you can to help your neighbors, well, that's just the way it is, and I think that's the way it's supposed to be. Hey, I hope we see some of you out there. I hope you're buling up a big old bull or stalking a muley buck, or having a great time in the West, and no matter what you're doing, keep your eyes to the skyline, because you just might see us out there doing it too. And if we do run into you, well, you can bet we're going to stop and share a cup and a fire, maybe some fire and elk stories. And if we don't see you out there, well, you can bet we'll be right back here so we can share another adventure from my wilderness journal.